I began to have my own positive mental suggestions of truth, which were to me like stepping stones. I will note a few of them. They came about 2 weeks apart. First, I am soul, therefore it is well with me. Second, I am soul, therefore I am well. Third, a sort of inner vision of myself as a four-footed beast with a protuberance on every part of my body where I had suffering, with my own face, begging me to acknowledge it as myself. I resolutely fixed my attention on being well, and refused to even look at my old self in this form. Fourth, again the vision of the beast far in the background, with faint voice, again refusal to acknowledge. Fifth, once more the vision, but only of my eyes, with the longing look, and again the refusal. Then came the conviction, the inner consciousness, that I was perfectly well, and always had been. For I was soul, an expression of God's perfect thought. That was to me the perfect and completed separation between what I was and what I appeared to be. I succeeded in never losing sight after this of my real being, by constantly affirming this truth, and by degrees, though it took me 2 years of hard work to get there, I expressed health continuously throughout my whole body. In my subsequent 19-year experience, I have never known this truth to fail when I applied it, though in my ignorance I have often failed to apply it. But through my failures, I have learned the simplicity and trustfulness of a little child." Close quote. But I fear that I risk tiring you by so many examples, and I must lead you back to philosophic generalities again. You see already by such records of experience how impossible it is not to class mind-cure as primarily a religious movement. Its doctrines of the oneness of our life with God's life is in fact quite indistinguishable from an interpretation of Christ's message, which in these very Gifford lectures has been defended by some of your very ablest Scottish religious philosophers. Footnote: the Cairds, for example, in Edward Caird's Glasgow lectures of 1890 through 1892, passages like this abound. Quote, "The declaration made in the beginning of the ministry of Jesus that the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of heaven is at hand passes with scarce a break into the announcement that the kingdom of God is among you, and the importance of this announcement is asserted to be such that it makes, so to speak, a difference in kind between the greatest saints and prophets who lived under the previous reign of division and the least in the kingdom of heaven. The highest ideal is brought close to men and declared to be within their reach. They are called on to be perfect as their Father in heaven is perfect. The sense of alienation and distance from God which had grown upon the pious in Israel must in proportion as they had learned to look upon him as no mere national divinity, but as a God of justice, who would punish Israel for its sin as certainly as Edom or Moab, is declared to be no longer in place, and the typical form of Christian prayer points to the abolition of the contrast between this world and the next, which thought all the history of the Jews had continually been growing wider, as in heaven, so on earth. The sense of the division of man from God, as a finite being from the infinite, as weak and sinful from the omnipotent goodness, is not indeed lost, but it can no longer overpower the consciousness of oneness. The terms Son and Father at once state the opposition and mark its limit. They show that it is not an absolute opposition, but one which presupposes an indestructible principle of unity, that can and must become a principle of reconciliation. End footnote. But philosophers usually profess to give a quasi-logical explanation of the existence of evil, whereas of the general fact of evil in the world, the existence of the selfish, suffering, timorous, finite consciousness, the mind-curers, so far as I am acquainted with them, profess to give no speculative explanation. Evil is empirically there for them, as it is for everybody. But the practical point of view predominates, and it would ill agree with the spirit of their system to spend time in worrying over it as a mystery or problem, or in laying to heart the lesson of its experience, after the manner of the evangelicals. Don't reason about it, as Dante says, but give a glance and pass beyond. It is avidya, ignorance, something merely to be outgrown and left behind, transcended and forgotten. Christian Science, so-called, the sect of Mrs. Eddy, is the most radical branch of mind-cure in its dealings with evil. For it, evil is simply a lie, and anyone who mentions it is a liar. The optimistic ideal of duty forbids us to pay it the compliment even of explicit attention. Of course, as our next lecture will show us, this is a bad speculative omission, but it is intimately linked with the practical merits of the system we are examining. Why regret a philosophy of evil, a mind-curer would ask us, if I can put you in possession of a life of good? After all, it is the life that tells, and mind-cure has developed a living system of mental hygiene which may well claim to have thrown all previous literature of the Diatétique der Seele into the shade. This system is wholly and exclusively compacted of optimism. Quote, "Pessimism leads to weakness. Optimism leads to power. Thoughts are things," close quote, as one of the most vigorous mind-cure writers prints in bold type at the bottom of each of his pages. And if your thoughts are of health, youth, vigor, and success, before you know it, these things will also be your outward portion. No one can fail of the regenerative influence of optimistic thinking, pertinaciously pursued. Every man owns indefeasibly this inlet to the divine. Fear, on the contrary, and all the contracted and egoistic modes of thought are inlets to destruction. Most mind-curers here bring in a doctrine that thoughts are forces, and that, by virtue of a law that like attracts like, one man's thoughts draw to themselves as allies all the thoughts of the same character that exist the world over. Thus one gets, by one's thinking, reinforcements from elsewhere for the realization of one's desires, and the great point in the conduct of life is to get the heavenly forces on one's side by opening one's mind to their influx. On the whole, one is struck by a psychological similarity between the mind-cure movement and the Lutheran and Wesleyan movements. To the believer in moralism and works, with his anxious query, "What shall I do to be saved?" Luther and Wesley replied, "You are saved now, if you would but believe it." And the mind-curers come with precisely similar words of emancipation. They speak, it is true, to persons for whom the conception of salvation has lost its ancient theological meaning, but who labor nevertheless with the same eternal human difficulty. Things are wrong with them, and "What shall I do to be clear, right, sound, whole, well?" is the form of their question. And the answer is, you are well, sound, and clear already, if you did but know it. The whole matter may be summed up in one sentence, says one author whom I have already quoted. Quote, "God is well, and so are you. You must awaken to the knowledge of your real being." Close quote. The adequacy of their message to the mental needs of a large fraction of mankind is what gave force to those earlier gospels. Exactly the same adequacy holds in the case of the mind-cure message, foolish as it may sound upon its surface, and seeing its rapid growth in influence, and its therapeutic triumphs, one is tempted to ask